if you took a survey of how many people in the U.S. think the next generation of Americans will be better off than the current generation, that percentage has steadily gone down for the last 40 years. The experts will tell them about all sorts of incredible things that are just around the corner, but after 40 years of waiting, fewer and fewer people believe it. I think the sort of common sense experience that a lot of people have should not be simply dismissed out of hand. I think that if you have technological progress, it frees people up to do more productive things, and that's how we should think of it. You know, when you shut down the horse buggy factory, there are a lot more jobs building cars, and people are generally better off as you have these things happen. I think at the same time, you have to reflect on the fact that if you gave that sort of a speech in Detroit and people who were working in car factories asked you, well, what would you do? And you said you have one word for them: computers. This would not be good advice if you say we're running for Congress or something like that. And I think this would be true. This would be true not just in Detroit, but in most of the U.S. And so, while I agree with you that there have been a few jobs that have been very productivity enhancing, and there is a thin tip of the spear of the computer revolution that continues apace, it is not clear it's enough to drive the whole economy. And no political leader can comfortably say you should look to Silicon Valley, because there is some sense in which it's not actually creating enough wealth to really transform things. And I think that's why, even though I agree with you in theory, I think in practice it's not a compelling argument, because people sense there's something a little bit fishy about it. The numbers don't quite add up. If the Google analysis is, of course, Google's a monopoly. It's a monopoly search engine company. It only works as long as there's nobody else doing it. And so, by definition, it is a company that only works as long as you have a few thousand people that can do it. It's, by definition, not scalable. And I think that's sort of a question that one should explore a lot more. And that's why you can't say everybody should be like Google. I think there is room for both learning things about process and substance, but I think it should be about 80% substance and 20% process. And there is a way to get the process and do things right, and a way to do things better. But there's probably one of those sort of diagnostics of what's gone wrong is that we've substituted process thinking for substantive thinking in many different domains in our society over the last 40 years, where we think, and it's a lot easier. Process is a lot easier. And so in a world where everyone thinks substantively, there may be some procedural shortcuts where you just, if you have a lot of people substantively thinking about how to invest in the stock market, the procedural shortcut is to buy an index fund. Yeah. But it may not work if everyone does process. And we're probably in a world where things are way too geared towards process and away from substance. I'm on the side that there's been less technological progress than people often advertise in recent decades, and that unless something is done to fix this situation, we're likely to have even less in the decades ahead. It is my position that there was tremendous technological progress in the world from about 1750 to about 1970, and that since the early 70s, it has slowed down precipitously. There's one major exception to this. The exception is computers and computer technology and the various spin-offs from that. And I think we will have plenty of time to discuss how important computers are. But the question I want to start by tackling in these opening comments is to get people to think a little bit about all the other areas of technology where things have decelerated very badly. And I would submit that almost everywhere else there's been deceleration. And this is whether we look at transportation, energy, commodity production, food production, agrotech, all sorts of technologies that didn't even happen, nanotechnology, cognitive enhancement, life extension technologies, and that with the exception of computers, we've had tremendous slowdown. I will not disagree with my sort of friendly rival George Gilder here if he's to say that computers have been getting better and cheaper. I fully agree with that, but what I would submit to you is that that's not the most important vector or the only vector for us to look at. And let me begin with making some comments about some of these other areas. I think if we start with the most literal version of the question, are we accelerating or decelerating? Or how fast are we moving? The most literal version is to look at transportation. And if you looked at transportation, people moved faster every decade, probably from 1500 on. They had faster sailboats in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, faster railroads in the 19th century, faster cars, faster planes. It culminated with the Concorde in 1976. It was decommissioned in 2003. And if you add in the sort of very low-tech airport security systems we have these days, you could say that transportation speeds are back to 1960 levels, and it's been literally flat. The space age is more or less over. It sort of ended in 2011 with the decommissioning of the space shuttle, even though, if truth were to be told, it probably already ended with the last Apollo landing in 1972, and the space shuttle program was sort of an extraordinary program that cost more and did less and was probably more dangerous than the original space program of the 50s and 60s. The most common reason people give for this slowdown in technology in transportation is that it simply cost too much, and it took too much fuel to fly supersonic planes. And this, I think, points to the much larger failure in energy innovation, where in very important ways we have not succeeded in undoing the oil price shocks of the 1970s. Oil prices on a per barrel basis in inflation-adjusted dollars were around $8 a barrel in 1973. By the end of the 70s, they were up to close to $100 a barrel. There was a big period in the 80s and 90s where prices came back down, but they've rebounded, and over the last 4 years have basically taken out the highs of the 70s, and we basically have an energy situation today that is worse than the Carter catastrophe of the late 70s, with oil prices at about $125 a barrel as of today. On this whole question of technological optimism versus pessimism, parenthetically, there was a very famous bet in 1980 between Julian Simon and Paul Ehrlich, where they sort of looked at a basket of 5 commodities, and it was a bet on, would things get cheaper or less cheap? And the argument was, you just look at, are these things going to get cheaper? And that will tell us whether we have technological progress or not. And Ehrlich picked 5 different ones, and he ended up winning on all 5, famously, in 1990. If you reran the same bet on a rolling decade basis, from 93 to 2003, 94 to 2004, Ehrlich's won the bet every decade since 1993, and he's won it by such a big margin in the last decade that he's more or less undone the price gains of the previous century. So there is something very, very strange about energy innovation. Within the Silicon Valley context, we've had this extraordinary failure of clean tech in the last decade, where and you can sort of diagnose, and there are all sorts of debates to what happened. It's a very important question, what went wrong. But on the most fundamental basis, it cost too much. It didn't quite work. The technologies didn't work as advertised, and it basically was this enormous black hole that probably destroyed a lot of venture capital firms, a lot of businesses along with it. And at this point, you could basically say that it sort of has become an increasingly toxic word for things for money-losing investments. If you look at nuclear power, of course, has been basically decommissioned. I think it would be sort of inappropriate and immoral to encourage any young person to study nuclear engineering. It hasn't had much of a future since probably the 70s, and although certainly Fukushima last year did not help in a world that is becoming increasingly hostile to any sort of innovation. If you look at Warren Buffett, who's arguably one of the great investors of all time, his single biggest investment is in the railroad industry in the U.S., and it's basically a bet against technology. And it's on 2 levels. It's a bet that people will be traveling more on railroads, and if you look at the main thing railroads transport, it's about 40% by volume is coal. And so Buffett is basically making the bet that the U.S. That the 21st century will look more like the 19th. People will go back to railroads, and instead of having clean tech from oil, all the clean tech will fail, the oil will run out, and we're going to go back to dirty coal. As we sort of broaden the scope from energy, we see the same in food production, where you have seen incredible run-up in food productivity. there was a famous green revolution of the 50s and 60s, which increased worldwide food production by something like 125% in those decades from 1950 to about 1980. In the decades since then, it's decelerated tremendously. There's been about 46% increase in food production since 1980, barely keeping pace with worldwide population growth. And so when you look at things like the Arab Spring, the so-called green revolution that's going on in the Middle East today, you can sort of optimistically, it always gets described as the byproduct of the information age, of people twittering and sort of how great technology is. But it, I think, can equally be attributed to a case of technological failure. And I think the immediate trigger was not democracy or Islam, but that people were just hungry. Food prices had gone up between 50 and 100% in the previous year, and you could basically summarize what's happened in the Middle East in the last year as people who had basically become, desperate people who have basically become more hungry than scared. Biotechnology is another area where by all rights we should be seeing tremendous progress, and we have not seen them. There are only about a third as many drugs in the FDA approval process today as there were 15 years ago. I think a lot of it has to do with bad regulation in that area, but there's also sort of a increasing sense that it's not even possible or worth trying to pursue these things. So, you could say in 1970, the U.S. Congress still believed that we could declare war on cancer and defeat cancer within 6 years. It was a resolution that we were defeated by the bicentennial in 1976. It's 42 years have elapsed since 1970, and in some sense we're 42 years closer to the goal, but most people think it's more than 6 years away before we defeat cancer. So the journey's taking longer, has taken longer, and therefore the expected journey is going to take longer than people think. And of course, all kinds of other major diseases like Alzheimer's, which probably afflict somewhere between a third and a half of the population at age 85, are not even, it's not even part of our public discussion to have a major effort to cure these diseases. People simply no longer believe in technology. I think if you look at the big pharma companies, they've basically, in the last few years, simply started firing all the scientists and researchers who've produced so little for the last 15 years. So I think you sort of have all these different details one can piece together on what's been happening. Now, I will concede, and have conceded, there is a lot happening on the computer and internet side, but I think the economic and political question is how big that is as an aggregate value relative to everything else. And I think the easiest way to look at this is looking at the economic data. Median wages in the U.S. have been stagnant since 1973. If you say this is because of rising wealth inequality, even if you factor that in, average wages, the mean has gone up by maybe 20%, which is still pretty pathetic. It's like 0.3, 0.4% a year. And you could say that basically, to a first approximation, the innovation in computers has been offset by the depletion in energy, and that we're sort of like Alice in Wonderland, where people have had to run harder and harder simply to stay in the same place. So the computers have been going faster, and it's been offset by relentless depletion in energy, which has basically kept the economy in roughly the same place. Now, I think one of the things that's very important about this debate is I want to say that I'm not happy, like, sort of giving a negative story here. I work as a venture capitalist. I'm interested in trying to reverse and undo this trend. And so I think we always need to separate the tech slowdown thesis as a fact and as a problem. And I try to solve it as a problem because I would like to see the next few decades see a lot more progress than we have seen in the last 40 years. I would like to see some of these this trend towards stagnation and decline reverse itself. But it is also a fact. And when one denies the fact, and when one tells utopian stories about a cornucopian future that's just around the corner, you will encourage people to make a lot of mistakes, to misallocate a lot of capital. And I believe that one of the most extraordinary economic facts of the last few decades has been the series of extraordinarily big and extraordinarily destructive bubbles that have led to the incredible misallocation of a lot of capital. There was the I think the first one was sort of the Japan bubble of the 80s, which was centered on a tech story. There was of course the tech bubble in Silicon Valley in the 90s, which was most directly centered on a tech story that turned out to be untrue. But even things like the housing finance bubble of the last decade were predicated on the idea that house prices would always go up, and it was because the economy would always grow. And in an advanced country, economic growth is driven by technological improvement. I think we have an education bubble. We probably have a government bubble. There would be no problem in the government taking on all the debt that it's taking on if you had lots of growth. If the underlying economy was growing and was going to double in the next 20 years, there's no problem in doubling the debt. That's sort of the Krugman Keynesian argument: is we can print money because things grow on trees. And I think the people who are on the right in the 20s and 30s were wrong about technological progress. And if they had someone like George Gilder encouraging the Fed to print more money in 29, 30, 31, 32, that would have been good. And the Fed at the time believed you couldn't print money because you'd get inflation. And it turned out in the 30s there was incredible technological progress and there was no inflation. You could take the country off the gold standard. You could print money. Money literally grew on trees because there was all this cornucopian progress. The politics got screwed up, but the technology was great in the 30s and 40s. That's not the world we're living in today. We're living in a world where people believe this utopian story. They believe that you can print money, that things grow on trees, that technology is easy, that it's automatic, that it's relentless. And as a result of believing this, we've gotten sort of trapped in one bubble after another. I think there are sort of a number of different directions one can explore politically. If you look at why there's so much, our political system is as fragmented as it is and as polarized, I think a big part of it is that it's become very hard to craft solutions where everybody comes out ahead. If you look at the Obamacare legislation from a few years ago, where people can disagree or agree on it, but what's remarkable is I believe it was the most important piece of legislation which was passed on a pure party line vote in the history of the U.S. There was no way to craft it where everybody could come out ahead. You could give uninsured people insurance, but only by reducing the quality of health care for everybody else. And that's the kind of solution you find in a world where there's no growth and where everything's zero-sum. There will be a loser for every winner, and people will start to suspect that the winners are involved in some sort of a racket. That's not the kind of world that I want to live in. I'd like us to find a way out, but I think if there is going to be a way out of the wilderness we've been wandering in for the last 40 years, we have to start by acknowledging that we're lost in a desert and that we're not in some sort of enchanted forest. Thank you very much.